My name is Dan Black. I am a professor here at the Harris School. I also hold an appointment at the university's National Opinion Research Center as a senior fellow. My primary research interest is that of labor economics, but labor economics is a very broad field within economics, and I have the proverbial short attention span, so I flitter around between lots of different areas. My major areas of interest at the moment tend to be what is often referred to as economic demography, how economic conditions affect things like birth rates, death rates, marriage rates, investments in education. And I'm also very interested in the measurement and the generation of economic inequality in the United States. I primarily teach at the moment an advanced statistics class for master's students. Historically, I have taught in the Harris schools in the Department of Economics PhD sequence known as Analysis of Microeconomic Data. In that course, we try to tell students how one takes microeconomic data and uses it in the research process, and in particular how one goes about drawing causal inference from microeconomic data. It really is asking the fundamental question how we learn stuff from data. And that seems like something that it should be obvious, but turns out it's much harder than we expect. And so it has been an area. I primarily started out my career as a theoretical economist and came to my interest in this field sort of late. And so I was very pleased to find very challenging theoretical issues in the question of how one draws inference about causation from economic data. I long had an interest in sort of the impact of college majors on the earnings of both men and women. One of my students here at Harris, Carolyn Sloan, who's now at the University of California at Riverside, along with Eric Hurst over at the Booth School of Business, became interested in understanding how the selection of college majors affects the earnings gap between men and women. Historically, if you go back even prior to my generation, women were disproportionately represented in majors that were not very financially lucrative. That began to change fundamentally in the 60s and 70s, and to the extent now where women actually represent a majority of all accounting majors, for instance. In 1964, the Krannert School of Business at Purdue University didn't even have a female restroom on the classroom floor. So it went from essentially zero, very, very few women were in this field, to now a field that is dominated by women. Another classic case, a much smaller set of workers, but still a really interesting one, is that of pharmacists. Pharmacists used to be overwhelmingly male. They are now by far a strong majority of women coming out of with a pharmacy major. Other areas that have been greatly affected, law has changed fundamentally, medicine has changed fundamentally. So we've seen this massive growth in certain areas that were traditionally male, and they have now become almost traditionally female. Even in the so-called STEM fields, you see areas like biology, which is now really dominated by women. Women actually represent a majority of the PhDs in biology. And the question is, why have we seen such great progress in certain fields, accounting, pharmacy, biology, not so much progress in the fields of engineering, for instance? And so what we do is we sort of examine how it is we have seen these big changes in the majors of women, but they have stayed away from certain fields that are traditionally male, but have overtaken men in other fields that are traditionally male. So it's a very challenging project. One of the big surprises that we found, and we were certainly not expecting this, is that the progress of women in entering these traditionally male fields has really kind of slowed down, and in some cases has actually reversed. And so we do tend to see a little bit of reversals. Thus far, those reversals have not translated into a widening of the gender wage gap. So we find that very, very interesting and surprising. To our knowledge, we did not know that this slowdown had occurred. So that was very interesting. The other thing that is not particularly surprising to people who spend their time studying such things, but is probably not well known among the population in general, is that women now dominate higher education. If I count postdocs, PhD students, and students, I probably have 10 to 12 students working for me at any time. This will not include, I also have an appointment as a senior fellow at the university's National Opinion Research Center, and I have several people working for me downtown, as we say, where the NORC office is, as well as being here on campus. And so as I've gotten older, I feel like I'm more of a research manager than actually doing the research, but I think that's a natural progression as you age. And so, yeah, students are integrally involved in all phases of this research, both at the master's level and at the PhD level. The social sciences are a little bit different than the physical sciences and biological sciences. So, you know, if you were in science, you would probably go to work in someone's lab and work dutifully under them and learn some basic techniques of how, you know, how one actually conducts experiments. Of course, most of the experiments we're doing in economics and social science in general are experiments looking at what is often referred to as secondary data that we have not collected ourselves. And so a lot of the experience that students get at Harris is actually working on the secondary data under the supervision of professors. And that is something that you always want to have very close contact with faculty on, because doing this on your lonesome is awfully difficult. And so I think one of the jobs of a professor at a major research university is to train PhD students on how one goes about conducting serious social science research using these secondary data sources and teaching people how one actually applies statistics to actual data. Researchers at Harvard, Raj Chetty and Nate Hendren, have actually produced a scorecard that scores how various places in the United States do in terms of moving students. They look at the 25th percentile and moving those young men and women to relatively high earning, at least 75th percentile of earning. They have found some surprising results. In particular, they find where I grew up, Western Kansas is particularly effective at moving people from the 25th percentile to the 75th percentile. And so with researchers at Cornell, the Duke person just moved, Swarthmore and Carnegie Mellon, as well as the Census Bureau, we are looking at explanations for why we might see people who are moving out of rural areas in particular do so well financially when they get to urban environments, and why other areas, the Mississippi Delta area, for instance, do very poorly when they move to big cities. Well, there are certainly no shortage of public policy issues at the moment. We have large numbers of very important public policy issues facing us. As we're doing this interview because we, of course, can't have in-person meetings anymore. We have a great deal of uncertainty about how COVID-19 is going to play out. That is an essential public policy issue. I think there are lots of public policy issues that will grow out of this. It is a particularly interesting time to enter the realm of public policy because we have lots of issues. Something I was just mentioning to a colleague, we have strategic reserves for oil, but as we found out, we don't seem to have strategic reserves for surgical masks. I bet we do the next time we have an outbreak. It always shocks students how demanding social science research is in the drawing of causal inference. I mean, I think one gets used to looking at the popular media and saying, oh, well, I read this is true in, I'll pick on the New York Times. And of course, you will mention this to your professor and they'll say, why would you ever think that could possibly be true? And then you'll proceed to have a very detailed discussion about both the strengths and the weaknesses of the way that evidence was applied. And I think what's always very interesting to see is exactly how students develop the skills while they're in graduate school of taking data and understanding what the data is telling us, but most importantly probably is telling us what the data are not telling us. The graduate students here at Harris, I have to say, are the nicest bunch of people I think I've ever met. It is a very international program. I was once in a small group that I met with at lunch, and I just, right before the lunch, I had received a notice from the federal government of an open position, and I went into this group of, I think there were 9 to 11 students at this lunch, and announced that we had a open position for the federal government. The federal government in the U.S. requires U.S. citizenship. 2 of the 11 were U.S. citizens. So to give you an idea, we have students from all over the world. We have a huge Latin American contingent, huge contingent from South Asia, East Asia, Europe. And so it's always a very, very interesting group of people to interact with. I often have 25 to 35 students in a PhD class. That sort of reflects the popularity of the analysis of microeconomic data rather than my teaching ability, but those are necessarily a little bit more formal than you would expect smaller classes to be. The university has a commitment to running modest-sized classes for PhD classes, and I think that is appropriate for your advanced work. I've already talked about the importance on the ability to work with faculty on a relatively one-on-one basis and in small groups, and I think that's something one always wants to consider when selecting a PhD program. You want to be in an environment where the faculty will take their time and work with the students and help them understand the nature of the research process and the craft that you're having. So I think you want to look at how different institutions actually handle this mentoring process. You obviously want to also look at how it works when you're done. You want to look at how people do in the labor market once they obtain their PhDs. And you also want to make sure that the PhD program that you're considering actually has a high completion rate. There are a lot of institutions that sadly will invite you in and say sink or swim. That's not an environment I think that is particularly conducive to making the most of your graduate education. I think it's also difficult to overstate the importance of looking at outcomes of the students that you see. You want to go to institutions where people become successful, and there are plenty of examples, sadly, where there are some institutions that, while they get very good students, don't do much with those students, and that other places do a great job. And so don't be bashful about asking for information about the outcomes of the students when they're done. Don't be bashful about asking things like how many students do not pass preliminary examinations. That is an important input into your decision, and You have the perfect right to ask. Don't be bashful. We're very proud of the success of our students and think they have done great work out in the world, both in terms of the policy world, but also in terms of the academy.